We're continuing to explore themes around the consumer, the way how that we are given as interchangeable economic units or demand centres. Today we're going to explore the way how the NPC is the limit situation or being of the consumer. So when we're looking at the NPC, we could say that this is very much the end of the road, as it were. So if a consumer, if we're given as the interchangeable economic units and we don't question the nature of the way how we produce ourselves as such, then the NPC is a person that's given to life that is totally externalized thinking, and so only mouths narratives that are sanctioned, and so in turn reinforces the non-questioning of the consumer, and yet will sell themselves potentially on themselves as being otherwise. And if we frame it along this line, then the NPC is not just a small subset of people, but is pretty much near the totality of human beings when they never ask the questions that we are when we're literally exploring the principal product of the consumer. So in that way, everybody can be accused of being an NPC. So the way that we can relate the NPC to the consumer is ultimately through what we externalise when we're orientated towards life through discounting or through calculations. When we are orientated towards life through the marginality of our time, we externalise. And so we externalise our existential status, because if to be orientated towards a future self is achieved through a return, well, the return is on the value of the consumer that we produce. And because people invest in their time marginally through the role, they obviously externalise the production process in order to see that that orientation towards the marginality of their time or their role discounts the one that totalizes it. And so the actuary self, as I've talked about, is the one that sells themselves on work-life balance. And so in a certain way, the NPC becomes is another way of looking at the actuary self. And so if we understand it along those lines, well, if you look at calculative like logic and ultimately discounting relates to your presencing. So you can only present yourself as a consumer that you're given as, even knowing you'll sell yourself otherwise. And so when you're looking at it from that, the script that people run, if you're looking at an algorithm and what is a bot other than a person that works on a script for life or an algorithm, well, what would that script be? Wouldn't that be your work-life balance? Wouldn't that be the way how you're meant to get ahead? Wouldn't that be the socially, social proof of social mobility in reference to the totalizing claim that you don't question when you obviously have to be sold on the script for life? So in this way, the NPC becomes a limit situation of the consumer. And so as much as the NPC is given in reference, obviously, to where it comes from video games and, being used in a derogatory way in order to describe people that obviously engage in non-thinking, it can be applied beyond, obviously, its origination and obviously the way how it's utilised through what we just mentioned before, the way how life is given, through a algorithmic dispensation, as it were, or what is scripts that people run. So if you are automating a process for life, well, that's through the actuary self or the way how that you sell yourself on life, not to question your existential status. But the NPC is a way to then read the whole arc or the backstory to it. So if you don't connect the NPC to the consumer that you're given prior, then you won't understand the nature of its conditioned arising. And that's essentially what that's really what we need to explore, and the way how that we ourselves become implicated. And so, if we think along those lines, then once again, this is the way how that you look at our civilizational domain is set up a way of life to externalize thinking. Because if we use money as a tool for thinking, we are using calculation as a way to be orientated through discounting. As I said prior, to discount is obviously not to presence in a way that you would be orientated towards life indivisibly. And how can you, when you're sold the script of compensation, that life's given as a compensatory exercise. And so in that way, we could say that the script that an NPC works off is that life is given for a compensation, or that life is given for a return. So what you get out of life is what you put into it. But what do you put into it other than acquitting yourself of the transcendental truth claim that time is of value, and the way how you have to invest in the marginal self that's necessary for that? And so therefore that means to say that the NPC is the status, or what would be an NPC, kind of starts to shift. And because it's that limit situation, you can read obviously everybody in the same way. Because if everybody's given as a demand center and they don't know their existential status, or they don't know how that can occur, how could they not be an NPC? How could they not look at life, if they're looking at it in a certain way that externalizes thinking their existential status when they're given as interchangeable economic units? So that means to say that the NPC is very much the finished product, we could say. So if the consumer is a product, which I always talk about, well, the apotheosis, let's say, of the consumer is the NPC. So if the game, you've got the game of life and you're meant to play it well, yeah? But now obviously you've got the issue here is that that form of life is nearing its end of its life, its use-by date. And I always talk about that you have to re-qualify the self in reference to what would be post its redundancy. You have the choice of either you make redundant the consumer, or yourself, because you're in a state of redundancy, will be made redundant beyond, in a way where obviously you are considered a victim of circumstance, because your power has ultimately been externalized, and yet you don't know the nature of the way how that occurs. And so if through the auspices of the elite, and the elite, or whoever you want to basically accuse of your existential plight, if you externalize it and say the responsibility is somewhere else, when it's ultimately got to do with you produce yourself as a consumer, you are sold that script to run your life by, well then ultimately it necessitates understanding the way obviously how that occurs. And so the NPC is not an aberration, but is very much the finished product of the consumer. And so that enables scripts or narratives that are always derivative. So if work-life balance, and this is why work-life balance is the primary script, and the actuary self is the self that you invest in when you invest in the asset of the consumer, or the product that you become, or the way how that you invest in your time as a value, and it becomes valuable or an asset to you. And so as a result of that script, the script of other, say, narratives, let's say look at political narratives, well they're subordinate to that principal one. Nobody ever questions work-life balance, because if they did, then that's outside politics. That's outlier the dialectic of politics, and it relates to a spiritual question. If it relates to a spiritual question, well then it's got to do with your existential status, and ultimately the opportunity cost of your economizing actions. Because if the script is life's given as a compensatory exercise through the return that you seek for your absencing of the creative self, well, and if you don't recognize that, well then ultimately you won't have a larger field of vision to the potential for change outside obviously a totalizing claim that you completely disregard, or you externalize as such, because the primary script is the one that you are sold on. And so the ones that are subordinate is the way how that you get invested in the primary one for you not to question it. So that's what politics ultimately does, is that the dialectic of left and right is ultimately for you not to question what underwrites left and politics, which is the world view of commerce, which has got nothing to do, as I will repeat, nothing to do with goods and services, but you being the principal product. So we can say in this way that the majority of people that hurl that insult at other people are just as guilty as being an NPC if they haven't asked the fundamental questions that we're doing. And so what you have is you have the scenario of people, through the accusatory tone or inveighing these insults at people, If you were to ask them the question about your existential status, about it being a consumer, how does that occur? They will be completely fucking oblivious to this, and this is the issue. So, if you're looking at difference by degree, well, what's the difference between an NPC that's obviously gets sold on, say, political propaganda, but then a person who gets sold on work-life balance and they don't understand the way how they produce themselves. And so in that way, the difference between the two is by degree. It's not by kind, because if it's kind, then you're dealing with what the primary script, which runs our commercial paradigm, as I said. So you're sold not to see. That's the script. You are sold not to see. And so as a result of that, people get sold on their marginality through left, right, through, propagating, say narrative that relates to revivals and, say, progressivism and conservatism. So in order to externalize the spiritual question that relates to both. All right. And so therefore, they are both just as guilty as each other of externalizing thinking. So in that way, this throws into relief what we've talked about prior, which is the off message. So if the off message is off to the total paradigm and you can't entertain that, well, then you can't entertain essentially what would be the thought crime that's necessary. And thought crime, if you're looking at it from an Orwellian perspective, relates ultimately, to the totalitarian state. But where the thought crime relates to existential totalitarianism, right, which is I've talked about, is considerably more intractable, because the nature of the totalitarianism relates to the way how time's given to you. And it's easy to understand this when you just ask that question that I've always posed: do we have a choice on the way how time's given to us? Because if we don't, then we're beholden to that totalizing claim, and so a form of existential totalitarianism. And so this enables catering of, say, echo chambers. So let's say you've got competing, you've got these echo chambers that relates to different discourses, so different propaganda. If you're behind to existential propaganda, but you don't recognize that, then what happens is that your attention obviously is captured in reference to a niche, or what would be the dialectic that relates to politics. And so what is the excluded middle? The excluded middle is nothing else than existential arbitrage, which I always talk about. So the way out that you absence creativity, because in the context of, say, of a narrative that you're fed, well, there's a need for the narrative that reinforces a worldview. Now, the worldview is in reference to what's not in question. So, but people invest themselves otherwise. And so what they do is that they'll look at all these issues from left or right, but then as a result of that, they crowd out the ability to look at existential propaganda, which relates to the way how time's given to them. And so that the way how that it regions, say, narratives that are ultimately subordinate to the principal script, or, say, mode of being for life. Now, if that mode of being for life is never questioned, then ultimately what you're doing is that you're reinforcing each other, all right, in a rivalry, which obviously is predicated upon a certain understanding of cooperation, as much as that you will think otherwise. You're both cooperating on preserving, because you're fighting over ultimately the system that you don't know the nature of, and so therefore ultimately what you're doing is that you're preserving it through the force that you work against each other. And this is ultimately the way how our way of life works, because if you externalize the spiritual question, you're not looking at your existential status once again, and the way how you act, and the way how that you, through questioning outside, so that outside the totalizing claim or existential totalitarianism, to ask that off message, the off message that's totally off. And if you engage in that, then what you're doing is that you're removing yourself from echo chambers or narratives that are sold, and you're engaged in questioning beyond the calculation or discounting. And that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve here.